After years of working long hours in a corporate job that drained the life out of me, I had saved up every penny, every dime, to make a change. I had spent $420,000, my entire nest egg, on a dilapidated farm in the middle of nowhere. A forgotten place that, on the surface, seemed like a lost cause, but to me, it was freedom. The farm had been abandoned for years, sitting on 30 acres of rolling fields that were overgrown with wild grass. The farmhouse was a wreck, rotting wood, cracked windows, and a collapsed roof, but something about it pulled me in. The dream of turning it into a self-sufficient haven, a place to escape the chaos of the city, seemed like the answer to everything that had been missing in my life. I imagined long days working the land, planting vegetables, and raising chickens, with no deadlines or conference calls to worry about. It would be the kind of life I'd only ever read about in books, the kind of life that was mine for the taking, if only I could fix up the farm and make it my own. I walked around the property that morning, inhaling the fresh country air and admiring the vast, open space. The grass swayed in the breeze, and the old barn creaked, almost as if it was welcoming me. There was so much potential here, my potential, to finally live the life I had always dreamed of. I smiled to myself. It was a big gamble, but one I knew I had to take. The investment felt like the first real choice I had made for myself in years. But what I didn't know was that the fight for this land, this slice of freedom, was about to get a lot harder than I ever imagined. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, the only part of the house that had any semblance of structure. I pulled out the old deeds from my bag, looking over the paperwork one more time. The farm was officially mine. No one could take it away from me. Little did I know, there was one group who had other plans. A group I hadn't yet encountered, but who would soon make it clear that no one gets to live freely without paying the price. The HOA. A few days after I moved in, I started getting strange things in the mail. At first, I thought they were just random junk flyers from local businesses. But one morning, I found a stack of official-looking letters, all from the Cedar Grove Homeowners Association. The first few letters seemed harmless enough, leaflet-sized flyers with "Welcome to the community," messages and details about neighborhood events. But as I went through them, my stomach sank. One letter was thicker, with a glossy seal stamped at the top, Cedar Grove HOA, Property Membership Notice. I tore it open, puzzled, and started reading. As a new landowner within the expanded Cedar Grove HOA boundaries, you are required to register with our association and adhere to our community's rules and guidelines. Failure to comply may result in fines, legal action, and forced removal of structures deemed non-compliant with our standards. Please ensure payment of dues by the 15th of the month to avoid penalty. I stared at the letter in disbelief. I didn't remember seeing anything about being part of an HOA when I bought the property. The nearest community I had ever seen was Cedar Grove, a small, gated neighborhood several miles away. But my farm, where I was planning to live out my dream, wasn't even near that place. I had no interest in joining any HOA, much less a community that clearly didn't want anything to do with me. I reached for the phone and called the local office, asking for clarification. The receptionist was polite, but when I explained that I wasn't part of any HOA and hadn't signed up for any kind of membership, she seemed to pause. "Oh," she said, "it seems the Cedar Grove HOA has expanded recently, and now it includes your land. There's been a board vote. All new residents in this area are now considered part of the HOA." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They were claiming my land as part of their territory, without my consent. "Wait, so you're telling me my property is now part of the Cedar Grove HOA without my knowledge, just because they voted to expand?" I asked, incredulously. "That's right. We'll need your registration and dues to be in compliance with the new neighborhood guidelines. We'll be sending someone by for a visit soon." I hung up the phone, the weight of their words settling heavily on my chest. They were claiming my land, demanding I pay fees, and soon enough, they would likely be trying to enforce their rules on me. I looked out the window, the rolling hills of my farm stretching out before me. I had already invested everything into this place, everything, And now, this HOA, a group I had never agreed to, was trying to control it? I wasn't sure what kind of fight I was walking into, but it was clear now. My dream farm wasn't going to be a peaceful escape. It was going to be a battlefield. A few days after receiving the unsettling letter, I had barely settled into the daily rhythms of farm life when the next unwelcome surprise came knocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was out behind the farmhouse, trying to patch up a fence that had fallen into disrepair when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I glanced up, expecting it to be a delivery, maybe something to help me get the barn back in shape. But what I saw made my stomach twist. A shiny black SUV pulled up near the gate, and a woman in a business suit got out, holding a clipboard. She was tall, well-dressed, and moved with the kind of purpose that said she was used to getting her way. She walked toward the house without hesitation, clearly expecting me to meet her. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up to the front porch, trying to figure out who this was and what they were doing here. "Good afternoon," she said, her smile too sharp, like she already knew she had the upper hand. "I'm Diane Green, with the Cedar Grove HOA. I'm here to check in with you and make sure everything is in order on the property." "Check in?" I repeated, my eyebrows knitting together. "I didn't sign up for any HOA, and I'm not interested in joining." Diane's smile didn't falter. "Well, you're part of Cedar Grove now, whether you signed up or not. The HOA's boundaries have expanded, and that includes your property. We've been trying to reach you. I was hoping we could go over your registration and dues so that you can officially become a member of the community." I felt my pulse quicken. This was it. The first face-to-face encounter with the people who had already tried to claim my land through paperwork and legal threats. And now, here she was, demanding that I join their association and abide by their rules. It wasn't just about dues, it was about control. "Look," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I don't care what boundary lines you've drawn on some map. I didn't buy this land to be part of some HOA. I have the deed, and it doesn't say anything about being subject to your association. I'm not interested in registering with you, and I'm certainly not paying your fees." Diane didn't seem thrown off by my response. She didn't even blink. "I understand that this might be confusing," she said in a patronizing tone, "but this is the new reality for everyone in the expanded boundaries. The community voted, and the rules are clear. You need to comply with them, or we'll have to take further action." Her words were chilling. The idea of further action weighed on me heavily. I had read about HOAs getting aggressive, imposing fines for unapproved structures, enforcing ridiculous rules about yard maintenance, and even trying to seize properties. I wasn't about to let them control my dream, especially when I had already invested so much of my life savings into this place. "Further action?" I asked, trying to keep my anger in check. "What does that mean, exactly?" Diane's expression hardened for a moment before she replied. "If you don't comply, you'll be fined. Repeated violations could lead to legal action, and eventually, we may have to take steps to remove unapproved structures or impose other consequences." "Remove unapproved structures?" I repeated, my voice rising now. "You mean my house?" "Yes, if necessary," she said, like she was explaining something trivial. "We'll be inspecting your property in the coming days, and if anything is found to be in violation of the community guidelines, you'll have to make adjustments immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had no right to do this. I had already purchased the land, and now they were trying to control how I used it. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not signing anything, and I'm not paying you a cent. I bought this farm with my own money, and no HOA is going to tell me how to live here." Diane didn't argue further. She just smiled again, but this time it was thin and tight, the smile of someone who was used to getting their way. "We'll be in touch," she said before turning and heading back to her SUV. "And remember, the offer still stands. If you want to join the HOA, we can get this all settled quickly." As she drove away, I stood there on the porch, feeling the weight of the battle that had just begun. I wasn't about to roll over and let some HOA dictate how I lived my life. I had worked too hard for this place, and no one was going to take it from me. But this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to give up that easily. I could already feel it. The fight was coming. The following days were filled with a constant unease. Diane's visit was just the beginning, and I knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily. I spent every moment I could fixing up the property, continuing the work I had started, but the worry gnawed at me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how far the HOA could push their influence if I let them. Then, just 3 days later, the second visit came. This time, there was no warning. I was out in the barn, cleaning up after the animals when I heard the unmistakable sound of a truck pulling up near the gate. My heart sank. I dropped the rake in frustration and walked toward the front of the property. The same black SUV rolled up, and out stepped Diane, this time accompanied by a man wearing a suit and holding a briefcase. "Mr. Hayes?" Diane greeted me, smiling that same too polite smile. "I'm glad we could meet again. This is Greg, from the HOA's legal department. We just wanted to make sure you're aware of the seriousness of your situation." Greg stepped forward, extending a hand. His grip was cold, calculated. "We've been reviewing the property records, and it seems there's been a misunderstanding on your part. You've bought into a newly regulated area, and unfortunately, that means adhering to Cedar Grove HOA's policies." I couldn't help but feel the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't just about fees anymore. It was about them trying to control everything. I crossed my arms and looked them both straight in the eye. "No," I said, the words sharp and unwavering. "There's no misunderstanding. I've already told you that I'm not interested in being part of your HOA. I own this land legally, and I'm not signing any of your agreements." Diane looked at Greg, her smile barely hiding the annoyance beneath it. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "we're trying to resolve this amicably, but the longer you wait, the harder this will be. If you don't comply with HOA guidelines, we will have to initiate fines, and if that doesn't work, we may even take legal action to have your property rezoned under our jurisdiction." Greg opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. He slid a few papers toward me with a confident smile. "These are your official violation notices. I highly suggest you read them carefully. We've already conducted an inspection of the property, and it's clear there are several areas in which you are non-compliant with our standards." I glanced over the papers, scanning through the violations they listed. Outbuildings not up to code. Property boundaries not clearly marked. Yard overgrown. These were bogus claims, things they could easily fix with a little work. It was clear the HOA was just grasping at straws, looking for any way to push me into submission. I took a deep breath and set the papers aside. I'm not going to be bullied into paying fines I don't know. This land is mine, and I've spent every cent I have to restore it. I won't have you or anyone else dictate how I live here. Greg's eyes narrowed as he slowly stood up, packing the papers back into his briefcase. You'll regret this, Mr. Hayes. The HOA has the power to control this entire region, and if you're not careful, we'll make sure you comply with our rules, whether you like it or not. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air, then turned to Diane. They both started to walk back to their vehicle, leaving me standing on the porch, shaking with frustration. Consider this your final warning, Mr. Hayes, Diane called over her shoulder as they got into the SUV and drove off. I stood there, watching them leave, my mind racing. This was no longer just about property violations or membership fees. They were using their power to intimidate and control me, and it was only going to get worse from here. I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't back down. They were pushing me, and I wasn't going to let them take away everything I had worked for. The stakes had just gotten higher, but now I had no choice but to fight back. The days after the confrontation with Diane and Greg were a blur of anxiety and preparation. I spent hours every day looking over legal documents, reading up on HOA laws, and consulting with local attorneys. But nothing prepared me for what happened one morning, the day I came face to face with the next level of the HOA's intimidation tactics. I had just finished a cup of coffee and was walking out to check on the horses when I noticed something strange at the gate. The lock had been cut off. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten to secure it properly, but then I noticed something else, There were footprints in the soft dirt leading up to the barn. I rushed forward, my heart pounding. I reached the barn just as I heard the sound of voices coming from inside. My stomach dropped. I could hear the sound of tools clanging against metal, the sharp, invasive sound of work being done on my property. I shoved the door open, and there they were. 2 men wearing bright yellow vests and carrying clipboard-style documents. They were already in the process of removing a section of the barn's roof, making an absolute mess of the structure. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had actually seen this. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with both fear and anger. One of the men, a tall guy with a grizzled face, turned toward me and smiled smugly. "Good morning. We're just here to make sure your property meets HOA regulations," he said with an irritatingly friendly tone. "You see, there are safety guidelines we have to follow, and the roof's not up to code. We're here to make repairs and make sure everything complies with our standards." "Repairs?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "I never asked for any repairs." "You have no right to be here. Get off my land." The other man, shorter and with a darker expression, stepped forward, holding up a clipboard. "Actually, we do," he said coldly. "You've been informed by the HOA that you need to comply with certain standards. This roof and some of the outbuildings are in violation. We're just taking care of it for you." I was speechless. They weren't even pretending to ask for permission anymore. They were acting like they owned the place. "I'll call the police," I snapped, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, my hands shaking with fury. "You're trespassing. Get off my property, now!" The man with the clipboard took a step closer, almost blocking the door. "You're free to call the police, of course," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But we've already notified the authorities about our work. We have every right to make sure the land complies with HOA rules. This is your final warning. You need to comply with our standards, or we will begin charging fines." I could feel the walls closing in, the threat of fines and more aggressive action hanging over me. They weren't just trying to force me into paying fees, they were trying to take control of everything. They were using legal jargon and intimidation to steamroll me into submission. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It was Jillian. She had told me she would be stopping by to check on the progress of the situation. "Ryan?" she called out, stepping out of the car. When she saw the men in yellow vests, her eyes narrowed. She walked over quickly. "What's going on here?" "These men," I said, gesturing toward the 2 trespassers, "are trying to force me to comply with HOA standards. They're here tearing down my barn, without my permission, and I'm done letting them do whatever they want to my property." Jillian turned to the men. "This is illegal. You can't just come onto someone's property without permission and start making repairs. You need to leave now, or I'll call the authorities." The man with the clipboard scoffed, then waved his hand dismissively. "You can try calling the police. But the HOA has the right to ensure compliance. We've got all the paperwork. You're the one in violation here, not us. Don't say we didn't warn you." I had had enough. This was no longer a conversation. This was a battle for control of my land, and they weren't going to win it without a fight. "I'm calling the cops," I said, my voice now steady with resolve. As I dialed the sheriff's office, I saw the men exchange a look. The taller one sighed, seemingly annoyed. "Fine. But this isn't over, Mr. Hayes. We'll be back to finish the job." Just before they turned to leave, the shorter man gave me one final, warning look. "We'll see you in court." Minutes later, the sheriff arrived. Deputy Warren took one look at the scene and shook his head. He had been the one to help me the first time the HOA had overstepped, and it seemed like he was just as frustrated with their antics as I was. "All right," Warren said, addressing the men. "You 2 need to pack up and leave. You have no right to be here without explicit permission. If you try to come back, you'll be trespassing, and I'll be taking you in." The men hesitated, but with the sheriff's authority looming over them, they didn't protest. They packed up their equipment and left without saying another word. When they were gone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. This wasn't over, but it was a small victory, one that proved that I wasn't going to let the HOA walk all over me. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore. I was fighting for my freedom, my right to live without interference. As Warren turned to leave, he paused and looked at me with a sympathetic glance. "They'll try again. I know it. Just make sure you have everything in order. They're relentless." "I know," I said, my voice resolute. "But I'm ready." The tension in the air was palpable after the confrontation with the HOA goons. I couldn't believe what they had tried to do, break into my barn and start making repairs without my permission. But I had won that round, thanks to Deputy Warren, who made it clear to the HOA that they were overstepping. For now, at least, I had a little breathing room. But I knew this wasn't the end. The very next day, the mail arrived with another official-looking letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA, but from a law firm, and I could tell by the tone of the letter that they weren't messing around. The letter was a legal demand for payment, claiming that my farm was in violation of multiple HOA codes. They were demanding that I pay a hefty fine of $10,000 for non-compliance, and that I immediately sign the membership papers to join the HOA, or face further legal action. It was a bluff, but a dangerous one that came with the unmistakable tone of a threat. I felt a knot form in my stomach. They were escalating. They were not going to just let this go. I showed the letter to Jillian and Maxine that afternoon. Maxine, the savvy legal expert, looked over it carefully, shaking her head. "They're pulling out the big guns now," she said, her expression tight. "This is a classic intimidation tactic, force you into paying fines or complying by threatening you with legal action. But what they don't realize is that they're playing a dangerous game." Jillian looked at me, her brow furrowed. "They're trying to break you down, Ryan. This is what they do. They hit you with fine after fine, legal letter after legal letter, hoping you'll get overwhelmed and give in. But if we don't back down now, they'll realize they can't push you around." I could feel my frustration growing, the weight of it pressing down on me. $10,000? That was a significant chunk of the money I had left after purchasing the farm. It was enough to set me back in a major way, enough to make me question how much longer I could keep going if they kept throwing these legal grenades at me. But then the anger kicked in. No way. I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. I had spent everything to get this farm back in shape, to turn it into the life I had always dreamed of. And no HOA was going to take that away from me. I called Maxine and Jillian to my office, and we strategized. "We need to fight fire with fire," Maxine said, slamming the legal papers down on the desk. "We're going to hit them where it hurts. We need to expose them for what they are, bullies who are illegally trying to take control of land that isn't theirs." We spent the next few days gathering evidence, documents, photos, and video footage, everything that could help prove that the HOA was acting outside of their legal boundaries. Maxine also started drafting a counterclaim that would expose their fraudulent activities, how they had been expanding their jurisdiction without approval, and how they had been harassing property owners with threats and illegal fines. We also contacted local reporters to see if they could investigate the HOA's practices, getting the story out to the public. If the community saw what they were really doing, we could turn the tide in our favor. But just when I thought I might be able to catch a break, another shock hit. I was out in the field, working on some repairs when I noticed a strange vehicle parked by the fence. My stomach dropped as I recognized the black SUV from before. The same two men, the ones from the HOA, stepped out, looking more determined than ever. "What now?" I muttered under my breath. I quickly walked toward them, my hands clenched at my sides, ready for whatever they were about to throw at me. "You again?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The taller man, Dave, looked at me with a cold smile. "We're not here to talk anymore, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice low. "You need to pay the fines. You need to sign the paperwork. And if you don't, we'll be forced to take this to court. The HOA will win, and you'll lose everything you've worked for." My blood boiled. I wasn't about to let them threaten me into submission. You don't own this land, I shot back. I own it. And I'm not signing anything. So you can either leave or deal with it. Dave's eyes narrowed, and he looked at the shorter man, who stood silently behind him. You're making a big mistake, he said. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. And trust me, we won't stop until we get what we want. I stood my ground, not backing down an inch. You'll hear from my lawyers too. So you better be prepared. As they left, I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger and determination. I wasn't going to let them win. No matter what they threw at me, I was going to fight back. They had underestimated me, and I was about to show them just how wrong they were. This wasn't just a fight for the farm anymore. It was a fight for my right to live the way I chose. And I wasn't going to let anyone, especially a bullying HOA, take that away from me. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. And I was more determined than ever to win. The days after the second confrontation with the HOA felt like an emotional roller coaster. Diane and Greg's threats lingered in my mind, and a sense of unease was constantly gnawing at me. But I wasn't going to sit idly by and let them push me around. I had to fight, for my property, my future, and my right to live the way I wanted. Maxine had already laid the groundwork for a counterattack, but now it was time to gather evidence and build our case. I spent the next few days combing through property records, looking for loopholes in the HOA's claims. I wanted to find anything, that would prove they had no legal right to interfere with my farm. Jillian was in the process of compiling documents that could expose the HOA's illegal activities, including their fraudulent annexation and the false fines they had levied against me. But we knew we needed more. We needed to dig deeper and make sure that every single action they took was documented and could be used against them. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, Tom, the local real estate agent who had helped me find the farm. I hadn't heard from him since I bought the place, but when he knocked on my door, he had a serious look on his face. Ryan, he said, shaking my hand, I've been hearing some unsettling rumors about that HOA and the way they've been treating people. I know you've been dealing with them, and I want to help. I invited him inside, and after a few minutes of catching up, he leaned in closer. I've been doing some digging on my own, and I found something that might help you. He handed me a manila folder. This is a copy of the original zoning maps for the area around your farm. You see, when the HOA claims that your land falls under their jurisdiction, what they're not telling you is that their official boundary line has never been updated. There's no legal annexation for your property. They've been operating under outdated maps, and they've been changing those maps without anyone's knowledge. My pulse quickened as I flipped through the papers. Tom was right. The maps clearly showed that my property was outside the Cedar Grove HOA's boundaries. The HOA had never officially expanded into my area, and no vote had been taken to annex the land. This is huge, I said, my heart racing. If we can prove this, the HOA has no legal grounds to demand anything from me. Tom nodded. Exactly. And there's more. I also got a hold of some zoning board meeting minutes from last year. They were discussing potential changes to the area, but nothing was ever approved. It's clear they've been bluffing, hoping you wouldn't notice. I felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. The next few days were a blur as we worked quickly to organize everything. Maxine began drafting a legal complaint, carefully laying out our findings. We had proof that the HOA had no official claim to my land, no authority to impose their rules, and no right to charge me any fines. We had them dead to rights. In the meantime, Jillian started reaching out to local journalists, sharing the story of how the HOA had been bullying property owners and breaking the law. The more people who knew, the better. We couldn't just rely on the courts. We needed public support to expose the HOA for what they were, a corrupt, overreaching organization willing to trample anyone who got in their way. As we prepared to file the legal complaint and go public, I received an unexpected phone call from Deputy Warren. His voice was serious. Ryan, I think you should know, there's a new development. I've been getting reports from some of the other landowners in the area. The HOA's been trying to intimidate people into selling their properties. They've been pressuring anyone they can into compliance by threatening to withhold water rights, cutting off utilities, and other shady tactics. It's starting to look like this is part of a bigger plan to take over the entire area. My stomach turned. I had suspected the HOA's plans were more sinister than they let on, but hearing it confirmed made it all too real. They weren't just after my land, they were trying to take control of the whole region, one property at a time. Warren's voice softened. You need to be careful, Ryan. If they're starting to pull stunts like this, they won't stop until they've pushed everyone out. You're not alone in this, but you need to make sure you've got all your bases covered. The HOA's ruthless. And I'm worried they might try something worse to get you to back down. I nodded, a cold determination settling in. I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by legal files and property maps, I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go to get what they wanted. But I was ready for the fight. With Maxine, Jillian, and the community behind me, I was more determined than ever to win this battle. The HOA had pushed me to the edge, but it had also awakened something in me, a resolve to protect what was mine. I had sacrificed too much to let them take it away. And I was going to make sure the world knew exactly what they were trying to do. The war wasn't over. But now, I was prepared for them. The weeks following our preparation were a whirlwind. Maxine, Jillian, and I worked tirelessly, compiling evidence, organizing witnesses, and building a case that would expose the HOA's illegal practices. With Tom's maps, the zoning board minutes, and the overwhelming proof that the HOA had no legal claim to my land, we were ready. We had one shot at making this right, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. The court date for our legal complaint was set. We had filed everything with the county, and now we were officially taking the HOA to court for their fraudulent annexation, their illegal fines, and their attempts to control my property. I spent that week preparing, staying up late reviewing documents, and making sure every angle was covered. I knew this battle was going to be a fight, not just for Ruby Hill Vineyard, but for everyone the HOA had tried to bully into submission. But the day before the hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. It was late in the afternoon when I saw the familiar black SUV pull into the driveway. My blood ran cold. I knew exactly who it was. Diane and Greg were back. This time, they didn't have a legal document in hand. They had something far more dangerous. Diane stepped out of the car, her face a mask of calm determination. Greg, standing beside her, had a look of quiet confidence, like they were about to win. Mr. Hayes, Diane began, her tone clipped. We've come to offer you a deal. We understand that things have gotten heated, but we believe this can be resolved without further legal action. I raised an eyebrow. A deal? I asked, already knowing what was coming. You want me to sign your paperwork, pay your fines, and join your HOA? Well, I've already told you, no deal. Greg stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. You don't understand the power the HOA has in this region. We control land use, zoning, and even water rights. You can't win this fight, Ryan. The courts will side with us, because the county supports our expansion plan. If you continue this battle, we'll make sure it's a long, expensive fight, one that you won't win. I could feel my jaw tightening, the anger building in me. They were trying to intimidate me, but I wasn't going to let them. I had a right to defend what was mine, and I was ready to do whatever it took. I've already told you, Diane, I'm not signing anything, I said, my voice firm. Your HOA has no legal right to my land. And you're not going to bully me into submission. If you think you can control this property, you've got another thing coming. Diane's smile faded, and her eyes turned cold. You're making a big mistake, Ryan. This is your last chance to avoid the fallout. If you don't agree to our terms, we'll be forced to take this to the next level. We'll make sure your property is zoned out of existence. I didn't flinch. I wasn't afraid anymore. You'll have to go through me first, I said, locking eyes with both of them. And trust me, I'm not backing down. They left in silence, but the tension lingered long after their SUV disappeared down the dirt road. The threat had been real, and it was clear the HOA wasn't just going to roll over. They were desperate to control my land, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next day, we were at the county courthouse. The hearing was set, and the courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was thick as I walked in with Maxine and Jillian. I couldn't help but notice the HOA's legal team, seated at the other side of the room, their confident expressions hiding the fact that they knew they were about to face a real fight. Maxine leaned over and whispered to me, "We've got this. Just stay calm and let the evidence speak for itself." I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. This was it. The moment that could determine the future of Ruby Hill Vineyard, and my right to live the life I had fought for. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Maxine went first, presenting our case with sharp precision, outlining the illegitimate annexation, the HOA's illegal fines, and their overreach into my property rights. She laid out the facts, showing how they had no legal claim to my land and how their actions were driven by greed and control. Then it was the HOA's turn. Diane and Greg's legal team went on the offensive, trying to paint me as a rebellious property owner who simply didn't want to comply with community rules. They brought up their zoning maps, which we had already debunked, and tried to make the case that I was undermining the community's standards. But Maxine was ready. She quickly countered, pointing out that their maps were outdated, and their claims about annexation had no legal foundation. She then called on Tom, the real estate agent who had helped me with the purchase of Ruby Hill, to testify about the zoning issues and the lack of official HOA jurisdiction. The judge listened intently, and as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that the HOA's case was crumbling. They had no real legal standing, no legitimate claim to the land, and their tactics of intimidation and coercion were finally being exposed. The hearing wrapped up, and the judge announced that the decision would be made in a few days. As we left the courtroom, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We had presented a strong case, and there was no way the judge could side with the HOA after all the evidence we had provided. But as I stepped outside the courthouse, I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA might have lost in court, but they were far from done. And if they thought they could intimidate me into backing down, they had another thing coming. The real fight was just beginning. The next few days felt like an eternity. Every morning, I'd wake up with that same knot in my stomach, the anticipation of waiting for the judge's decision weighing on me. The court hearing had gone better than I could have imagined, but I couldn't let myself get too comfortable. I knew the HOA would never give up without a fight. On the third day after the hearing, I received a call from Maxine. The tension that had been hanging over us since the beginning of the legal battle was about to be resolved, for now, at least. "Ryan, I've got good news," Maxine said, her voice brimming with relief. "The judge ruled in our favor. The HOA has no legal claim to your property. All fines, fees, and the annexation attempt have been nullified. The court has dismissed their case." I let out a long, shaky breath. My heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. We'd won. The vineyard, my land, my dream, it was safe for now. The weight that had been crushing me lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel a real sense of relief. "That's incredible," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "They can't come after me anymore?" "No, they can't," Maxine confirmed. "But don't get too comfortable. They may appeal the ruling, or they might try to hit you with other tactics. The war isn't over yet." I knew she was right. This was just one victory in a larger, ongoing battle. The HOA had shown they weren't above intimidation and bullying, and if they wanted to continue, they could. The following week, I sat down with Jillian and Maxine to discuss the next steps. We couldn't rest on our laurels, especially with the HOA being as ruthless as they were. We had to stay vigilant. "We need to make sure they can't pull this stunt again," Jillian said, her face serious. "We have the legal victory, but we need to get the word out. If we don't expose them for what they are, they'll just keep coming back." Maxine agreed. "We'll keep applying the pressure." I'll work with some local journalists to make sure everyone knows the truth about the HOA's tactics. We've got the media and the court on our side now. The more people know, the less power the HOA will have. We agreed to start gathering support from other landowners in the area who had been affected by the HOA's overreach. It was time to unite the community and build a solid network of property owners who weren't afraid to stand up for their rights. If the HOA tried to push us around again, we would be ready. In the meantime, I threw myself back into the work I had been avoiding, the vineyard. The farm needed me, and I needed it. The crops were coming along nicely, and despite the setbacks from the HOA's interference, Ruby Hill Vineyard was starting to look like the place I had dreamed about. One evening, after a long day of work, I stood at the edge of the vineyard and watched the sunset. The colors spread across the sky like fire, painting everything in a golden light. It was beautiful, almost surreal. I thought about everything I had been through, the stress, the fear, the uncertainty. It had all been worth it. I had fought for this land and won. I wasn't just a vineyard owner anymore. I was a symbol of defiance. A reminder that sometimes it's worth standing up to the bullies. It was a moment of clarity, a moment that reaffirmed why I had chosen this life in the first place. But as much as I wanted to believe it was all over, I knew it wasn't. The HOA had been defeated for now, but I could feel their shadow looming. They were powerful, and they wouldn't give up easily. As I turned to head back to the house, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I checked the screen, and my stomach dropped. A letter from the HOA. My heart raced. What now? I opened the letter cautiously, only to find it was a formal notice about the HOA's appeal process. Despite the court ruling, they were planning to appeal the decision and take the case to a higher court. It wasn't over. The fight was just beginning. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had already fought. I had already won. And if the HOA thought they could break me, they were in for a rude awakening. I was ready for whatever came next. Ruby Hill Vineyard was mine, and I would defend it with everything I had.